Hi, this is NextGen Picks. I was walking through a big box store yesterday and I watched a guy almost drop 2 grand on a brand new, just released 2026 mid-range TV. I literally had to bite my tongue because right now, this exact week, we're in the middle of the absolute weirdest, most chaotic pricing window in the entire consumer tech industry. It's the April clearance crash. Actually, let me back up. The manufacturers really don't want you to know how this transition works. They're rolling out the shiny new models right now, right? But the secret they hide in the fine print is that the new entry and mid-level models are barely an upgrade. Sometimes they're actually a downgrade. They sneakily strip out the good image processors to save a few bucks. Meanwhile, to make room in the warehouses, last year's premium flagship OLEDs and high-end mini-LEDs are getting their prices quietly slashed by 40, sometimes 50%. If you appreciate us buying these sets ourselves and tearing apart the marketing BS instead of just reading from a brand spec sheet, hitting that like button and subscribe, NextGen Picks really helps keep this channel completely independent. Okay, so if you're about to buy a TV, stop. Put the credit card down because you are about to navigate a total minefield of fake specs, dynamic contrast lies, and sales that aren't actually sales. So here's the reality of the April clearance window. The manufacturers are intentionally creating confusion. They roll out the new 2026 models with massive marketing campaigns, plastering terms like AI-enhanced 8K and quantum neural upscaling across the boxes. They want you looking at the shiny new entry-level and mid-range sets. But what they don't advertise is that television technology does not actually leap forward every 12 months. It crawls. The physical substrate layers, the chemical compounds in the panels, those take years to evolve. What actually happens is that to get the new boxes onto the showroom floor, retailers have to fire sale last year's premium flagship inventory. The TVs that were built with premium components, higher grade power supplies, and actual quality control are suddenly priced the exact same as this year's plastic stripped down mid-range models. And you might be thinking, well, I want the newest processor. But the big lie of the TV industry right now is resolution. They push 8K or they push massive dynamic contrast numbers. But 8K is a mathematical joke at normal living room viewing distances. Unless you're sitting 4 FT away from an 85-inch screen, your human eye literally cannot resolve the difference. The hidden truth that actually dictates your long-term satisfaction is the system on a chip, the SoC. Because here is how we actually use TVs in the real world. You aren't watching pristine, uncompressed 100 gigabyte 4K Blu-rays every night. You're watching a heavily compressed, bitrate-starved 1080p stream of Netflix or a 720p YouTube video or a muddy cable broadcast of a football game. When you watch a dark scene in House of the Dragon and the background looks like a blocky, digital, pixelated mess, that's called macro blocking. And the only thing that fixes it is a processor powerful enough to analyze that garbage signal, smooth out the color gradients in real time, and upscale it without making it look like a blurry oil painting. This is why buying a premium clearance model is the ultimate cheat code right now. Let's look at the LG C series, specifically the C4, which is currently getting shoved out the warehouse doors to make room for the C5. I've been tracking the 65-inch C4, and the price is dropping to a point where the engineering value is frankly staggering. OLED is the gold standard for a reason. Every single one of its 8.3 million pixels generates its own light and can turn itself completely off. Zero light, absolute black. And contrast, that perfect black right next to a bright highlight, is what your brain actually interprets as depth, sharpness, and 3D realism. When you watch a movie with letterbox bars, and those bars are actually invisible against the bezel of the TV, the perceived image quality skyrockets. Add in the fact that the C-Series has 4 full bandwidth HDMI 2.1 ports for flawless 120Hz gaming, and it feels like the perfect TV. But wait, actually let me be totally honest with you here. I used to tell everyone to just blindly buy an OLED. I really did. I thought it was the universal, undisputed answer for every living room. I was wrong about that. There is a massive physical limitation with OLED technology that you only discover once it's bolted to your wall. It's called the Auto Brightness Limiter, or ABL. See, organic light-emitting diodes generate a lot of heat when they push peak brightness, and heat destroys the organic compounds. That's the literal cause of permanent burn-in. So, to prevent the TV from baking itself, the processor aggressively monitors the screen. If you put on a hockey game, or a snowy documentary, or any scene where a large percentage of the screen is bright white, the TV will panic. After about 30 seconds, you will physically see the entire image step down in brightness. It just dims, it goes gray. If your living room has massive uncovered windows, and you're trying to watch a daytime football game with the sun pouring in, an OLED is going to drive you insane. The glass finish will turn the TV into a giant, expensive mirror reflecting your couch. Before we pivot and talk about the blindingly bright TVs built specifically to solve that glare problem, I actually want to know what you guys are looking at right now. Drop the specific TV models or even the weird budget sound bars you're trying to decide between down in the comments. Seriously, I read them and your debates are exactly how I choose which units we buy and put on the test bench for next month's teardown. So, if your room is practically a greenhouse, OLED is out. You need a light cannon. This is where the marketing gets incredibly aggressive. You'll see brands pushing full-array local dimming or FALD, and specifically Mini-LED technology. The current mid-range sweet spots that are seeing massive discounts right now are models like the TCL QMA or the Hisense U8 series. They slapped these giant stickers on the box, bragging about 2,000, sometimes 3,000 nits of peak brightness. And yeah, they are retina-searingly bright. If a flashlight points at the camera in a movie, you will literally squint in your living room. It effortlessly cuts through afternoon glare. But here's the reality check that the spec sheet conveniently leaves out. To achieve that brightness without washing the entire screen out into a milky gray mess, an LCD TV relies on local dimming zones. It's a grid of thousands of tiny LEDs sitting behind the LCD layer. The processor tells certain zones to turn off to create dark areas and blasts power to other zones to create highlights. But there's a severe physical trade-off. The processor has to make split-second calculations. If a bright object moves across a dark background, think of white subtitle text over a black cinematic border. The zones behind those letters have to light up, but those zones aren't pixel perfect like an OLED. They're physical blocks. So the backlight bleeds out into the surrounding black pixels. You get this glowing, cloudy halo around the text. It's called blooming. And once your eyes learn to recognize blooming, you will see it everywhere. To hide this blooming, I noticed something really strange with how brands like Samsung and Hisense tune their mid-range panels. They will actually program the dimming algorithm to intentionally crush shadow details. They will instruct the dimming zones to stay completely dark even when there's supposed to be faint texture there, just to make the black levels look deeper in a showroom. You literally lose parts of the picture. You'll be watching a dark thriller, and a character wearing a navy blue suit in a dimly lit room just looks like a solid, textureless black void. It's an algorithm choosing a fake, marketing-friendly deep black over the actual accurate image, and then there's the panel lottery. When you buy a cheaper, new-release mid-range TV instead of a discounted premium clearance model, you are taking a massive gamble on factory quality control. You get it home. You put on a soccer game. The camera pans across the green field, and you see these faint, vertical, gray bands behind the image. That's the dirty screen effect, or DSE. It happens because the layers of the display weren't bonded perfectly flat at the factory. And it's not covered by warranty because the manufacturer considers it within normal operating spec. Premium panels have significantly tighter QA tolerances, which is another reason why buying last year's top-tier model is a much safer bet than this year's budget hype. But we have to talk about the software because this is the single most common reason I see these TVs end up on Facebook Marketplace after just 2 or 3 years. The honeymoon phase lasts about 12 months. Out of the box, the Tizen or Google TV interface feels relatively snappy, but TV manufacturers use the cheapest, bare minimum memory modules they can get their hands on. after a couple of major OS updates, and after the TV spends a year silently downloading background cache data for the unskippable, full-screen ads they relentlessly inject into your home menu, the whole system decays. You press the volume button and the bar shows up on screen 2 seconds later. You try to open the settings menu to adjust the brightness, and the TV completely freezes for a moment. This is the UI friction that drives long-term owners crazy. It's why I always tell people to treat their TV as a completely dumb monitor. The internal processing power should be dedicated strictly to cleaning up image gradients and handling motion. Do not rely on a TV's internal society to run a bloated smart OS. Spend the extra money on an Apple TV 4K or a dedicated NVIDIA Shield. Keep your TV off the internet if you can. Let me explain that a bit better actually, especially regarding how the processor handles its workload, because there is a really sneaky trick that companies pull with game mode that nobody realizes until it's too late. If you hook up a PS5 or an Xbox Series 10, you obviously want low input lag. You want to press jump on your controller and see the character jump instantly. So, you toggle on game mode, the input lag drops from a sluggish 80 milliseconds down to a highly responsive 10 milliseconds. It feels incredible. But have you ever noticed that the moment you turn game mode on, your expensive game suddenly looks a little flat? The colors don't pop as much, and the shadows look a bit gray. That's because to achieve that ultra-low input lag, the TV literally turns off its advanced processing. It completely bypasses the heavy gradient smoothing, and on mid-range Mini-LEDs, it significantly dials back the local dimming algorithm. The TV simply does not have the computational horsepower to map thousands of moving dynamic dimming zones in under 10 milliseconds. So, you paid top dollar for a premium HDR experience, but the moment you start gaming, the TV handicaps its own hardware just to keep up. You sacrifice the very technology you bought the TV for. It's these hidden realities, the blooming, the ABL dimming, the processor shortcuts, that make navigating this market so frustrating. And it only gets more complicated when you step up into the high-end enthusiast space. Because when you step up into the enthusiast tier, the $2,000, $3,000, sometimes $4,000 bracket, the trade-offs don't disappear. They just get more controversial. Let's look at Samsung's flagship right now, the S95 series, specifically the S95D. This is a QD OLED, quantum dot OLED, and on paper, it is an absolute marvel of chemical engineering. Traditional OLEDs, like the LG C4 we talked about, use a white subpixel to boost brightness, which means at peak luminance, the brightest colors actually get slightly washed out. They lose saturation. Samsung's QD OLED doesn't use a white subpixel. It uses a pure blue OLED layer, firing through quantum dots to create red and green. The result is massive, unapologetic color volume. If you're playing a visually dense game like Cyberpunk 2077, neon lights don't just look bright, they look deeply, richly saturated. It is stunning. But Samsung made a physical design choice with the S95D that has absolutely fractured the home theater community. And it is the perfect example of showroom marketing fighting against real-world physics. They slapped a matte anti-glare coating over the entire screen. Their logic is that in a bright room, you won't see the reflection of your lamps or your windows. And it works, sort of. It diffuses the light, but light doesn't just disappear. The laws of physics dictate that the ambient light hitting that matte layer is scattered across the surface of the panel. So, if you have a window open, that diffused light literally raises the black floor of the TV. The perfect, absolute, infinite black that you paid over $2,000 to get, it turns into a milky, dark charcoal gray. You are fundamentally sacrificing the single greatest strength of an OLED panel just to mitigate window glare. It feels entirely backwards. I actually want to hear your take on this. Are you team glossy where you get perfect blacks but have to deal with reflections, or are you team matte? Tell me in the comments, because I swear this argument is tearing AV forums apart right now. And while we are talking about Samsung, we have to talk about the stubbornness, because if you buy a high-end Samsung TV, you do not get Dolby Vision, period. You get standard HDR10 and their own proprietary HDR10 Plus format. And they will tell you that their internal tone mapping is so good that you don't need Dolby Vision. Let's be completely blunt about what's actually happening here. It's not an engineering choice, it is pure corporate ego. Samsung refuses to pay the licensing fee to Dolby. They don't want to hand over a couple of dollars per unit. So instead, you, the consumer spending a premium on a flagship television, are locked out of the industry-standard dynamic HDR format used by Netflix, Disney+, and Apple TV. You are buying a compromised experience right out of the box because two massive tech giants refuse to play nice. And honestly, it's insulting. If you want to talk about avoiding compromises, you inevitably end up looking at Sony, specifically the new Bravia 9. Sony has basically abandoned OLED for their absolute top-tier flagship and gone all in on a wildly advanced Mini-LED. And man, the Sony tax is real. You are paying OLED prices. Well over $3,000 for a 65-in for what is fundamentally an LCD television. But here is where the spec sheet completely fails to tell the story. Sony doesn't win on paper. They usually have fewer dimming zones than Hisense or TCL. They don't always hit the absolute highest peak brightness in test patterns. But when you actually sit down in a living room and watch a Thursday night football broadcast, which is usually a heavily compressed, artifact-riddled 720p disaster, the Sony absolutely destroys the competition. It comes down to their XR image processing chip. The math their processor is doing in real time is terrifyingly good. It analyzes the garbage signal, identifies the noise, smooths out the muddy grass on the football field, and upscales the motion without introducing that horrific soap opera effect where everything looks like it was shot on a cheap camcorder. Furthermore, the Bravia 9 uses a proprietary backlight master drive. The physical miniaturization of the LED drivers allows them to control the light with an agonizing level of precision. The blooming I complained about on the mid-range models, it is almost entirely eliminated here. But wait, I need to make sure I'm framing this correctly because even the Bravia 9 has physical limitations. It is still an LCD, it uses a VA panel, which means the liquid crystals are aligned vertically to give you the best contrast. The trade-off for a VA panel is viewing angles. Sony puts a wide-angle optical layer on the screen to help, but if you have a wide U-shaped sectional couch and you are sitting all the way on the far left edge, the colors are going to shift. The contrast will drop. You simply do not get that flaw with an OLED. And these are the specific physical realities you have to measure your living room against. Let's move away from the $3,000 flagships and talk about the budget and mid-range space again, because there is a deeply frustrating ownership reality here that reviewers rarely catch, mostly because we only test these TVs for a couple of weeks before sending them back. I'm talking about long-term structural and firmware failures. When you buy an entry-level Hisense or TCL, you are getting an insane amount of hardware for the money. Full-array local dimming for under $500 is a miracle, but the manufacturers have to claw that margin back somewhere. They do it in the chassis materials, the power supplies, and the software QA. Have you ever been sitting in a quiet room and your TV suddenly makes a sharp pop or cracking sound from the back panel? That is the cheap, thin plastic chassis physically expanding and contracting under the thermal load of the backlight. They don't use heavy metal heat sinks. The power boards run incredibly hot and over a 2 or 3 year span. That repeated thermal stress degrades the internal capacitors. This is why you see so many budget TVs end up on the curb with a backlight broken, screen is dark, sign taped to them. The panel itself is fine. The cheap power board cooked itself to death. And then there's the firmware. Oh man, the firmware. You get the TV mounted, you buy a nice soundbar, you plug it into the HDMI EARC port, everything works flawlessly. 3 months later, the TV automatically updates its software in the middle of the night, you'll wake up, turn on a movie, and the soundbar just randomly mutes for 2 seconds every 10 minutes. Or it loses sync so the actor's lips are moving, but the audio is delayed. This is an EARC handshake failure. It is rampant in the budget and mid-range tier. The TV's updated software suddenly stops communicating correctly with the soundbar's processor, and you will spend hours swapping HDMI cables, resetting the TV to factory defaults, digging through Reddit threads, trying to fix a bug that the manufacturer introduced and will likely never patch because they've already moved on to next year's model. This is the hidden cost of spec chasing at the bottom of the market. You get the 1000 nits, you get the local dimming, but you sacrifice system stability. You become an unpaid beta tester for their operating system. It all comes back to how you actually live in your house. The physical realities of your space, the amount of light coming through your windows, the patience you have for glitchy menus, the type of content you actually feed into the screen. So, how do we actually navigate this? How do you walk into a big box store or go online this week and buy a television without getting completely played by the clearance cycle? You have to stop looking at the spec sheets and you have to look exclusively at your own living room. You have to categorize these TVs by who they are actually built for, because the perfect TV does not exist. It just doesn't. There are only perfect TVs for specific environments. Let's group them. First, the glare battlers. If you have a living room with a massive sliding glass door, or if you have skylights, or if you religiously watch Sunday football with the blinds wide open, you cannot buy an OLED. I really don't care how cheap the clearance prices get this month. The glass finish will turn the screen into a black mirror, and the ABL we talked about will dim the picture until the grass on the field looks like gray mush. For you, you need to look strictly at the premium Mini-LED market, specifically the TCL QM8 or the Hisense U8 series. Yes, you are going to deal with a slightly clunky user interface. Yes, if you watch a movie with subtitles, you are going to see a little bit of blooming around the text, but in a sun-drenched room, absolute black levels do not matter. They physically do not matter because your pupils are contracted from the ambient light in the room anyway. You need the brute force, raw power of a 2000 plus night panel just to punch through the glare and make the image visible. It is a sheer horsepower solution, but for that specific bright room, it is the only correct one. But what if you control your lighting? What if you are a cinema purist or a spec-chasing gamer who plays mostly at night or in a basement setup? This is where the April clearance crash becomes your absolute best friend, and this is my pick for best value in the entire market right now. The LG C4 OLED. I know the brand new C5 is hitting the shelves as we speak. The box looks sexier. The marketing pamphlet claims a 15% boost in AI neural processing. I'm telling you right now, as someone who stares at these panels with colorimeters and thermal cameras, do not pay the new release premium. Do not do it. The physical OLED substrate, the actual glass generating the light, is functionally identical for real-world viewing. The C4 gives you perfect infinite contrast. It gives you 4 full bandwidth, 48 gigabit HDMI 2.1 ports, which means you don't have to choose between plugging in your PS5, your Xbox, or your EARC soundbar. Everything just works. And because it's been on the market for a year, there is a massive database of calibration settings online to get the colors perfectly accurate. Right now, retailers are slashing hundreds of dollars off the C4 to clear warehouse space. The math is undeniable. It is the absolute sweet spot. Just do yourself a favor, set it up, immediately disconnect it from the Wi-Fi, and plug in an Apple TV 4K or a Roku Ultra. Protect yourself from the SmartOS decay. Now, if we are talking best overall, if money is literally no object and you just want the absolute best, most flawless image reproduction possible across any type of content, it's the Sony Bravia 9. And honestly, it pains me a little bit to recommend an LCD panel at an OLED price point, but the engineering here is just that undeniable. You aren't really paying for the panel, you are paying for the XR silicon. Actually, let me explain why that matters so much. If you stream a dark, moody show on Max or Hulu, the compression algorithms on those servers usually destroy the shadows. You get these blocky, flashing artifacts in the dark gray areas. The Sony processor is the only chip on the market that I implicitly trust to take that garbage, low bitrate signal, analyze the noise, smooth out the macro blocking, and reconstruct the gradient without destroying the natural film grain of the movie. It is practically magic. Combine that with their microscopic backlight control that essentially eliminates blooming, and you get a cinematic experience that works perfectly in pitch black rooms and bright Sunday afternoons. It is the king of the hill. You just have to pay a massive Sony tax to get it. But before we wrap this up, I have to drop a truth bomb here, and it's a reality check that almost no one in the enthusiast space actually wants to admit. You can buy the Sony Bravia 9. You can buy the LG OLED. You can spend $3,000 on the perfect display, but the television is only half of the equation. What undeniably dictates your satisfaction is your source material. I have been into so many homes where someone bought a top-tier flagship TV and they have it hooked up to a dusty 7-year-old cable box outputting a heavily compressed 720p or 1080i signal, and they ask me, NextGen Pics, why doesn't it look like it did in the store? Because in the store, they were feeding it an uncompressed 100 GB proprietary video file running directly off a flash drive. The quality of your incoming bitrate is the invisible ceiling on your TV's performance. If you are going to invest in a premium display, you have to upgrade your source. Buy a standalone 4K Blu-ray player for your favorite movies. Hardwire your streaming box with an Ethernet cable instead of relying on spotty Wi-Fi, so the streaming apps actually ramp up to the highest 4K bit rate. Stop starving your expensive hardware. If you are ready to pull the trigger and take advantage of this clearance window, I've put links down in the description to the exact specific model numbers I talked about today. These are vetted sources. I use these links to make sure you are getting the correct US hardware revisions, avoiding third-party marketplace scams, and dodging the panel lottery as much as possible. It is the safest path to actually getting what you pay for. I'm NextGen Pics. Stop watching test patterns, go watch a good movie, and I will see you in the next one.